Well, I mean, what a story. When I saw it was one of the scriptures that was assigned for this week, to be honest with you, I wanted to avoid it. I've always found this story to be very troubling, maybe you as well. This poor woman and her child are being sent out into the wilderness by her master. But after studying it, I've discovered it's actually a story that's filled with these really wonderful, unexpected treasures. And today I want to highlight just two. And the first has us thinking about how we understand our world and the judgments and prejudices that we hold usually toward one people group over another. But before we get to that, a little bit of a context I think helps make sense of it even more for us. So the story involves Abram, who becomes Abraham, and Sarai, who becomes Sarah, Hagar and the children between them, Isaac and Ishmael. And in Genesis chapter 12, God comes to Abram and covenants or promises to him that even though he and Sarai were barren and very old, a child was soon going to come from them. And from that child would come a nation as numerous as the stars in the sky. And from that nation would come one who would, in the end, redeem the whole world. But of course, after that promise, years go by and no child arrives. And so Abram and Sarai concoct a plan. They decide to take the promise into their own hands. And he sleeps with his servant Hagar. And Hagar conceives, and from her comes this boy, Ishmael, whose name means, and I want you to hold on to this for a little bit later on, God hears. But this conception is not how God ever intended to fulfill the promise to Abram. And so years would pass again, and then finally, in their very old age, Sarai, now Sarah, conceives, and she gives birth to Isaac. Isaac is the fulfillment of God's covenant promise. And from him would come Jacob, who is called also Israel. And from Israel would come 12 sons, and these 12 sons would be 12 tribes. And from these 12 tribes would come a nation. And from this nation would come the Redeemer of all the nations. Well, in our story, Isaac now has been weaned. And a party is thrown to celebrate this. And the older boy, Ishmael, attends, but he's described as mocking. Sarah's angry with what she sees, and she orders that Abraham have the boy and his mother sent away. Abraham is grieved. It's a son. But then God comes to Abraham in his grief, and he makes another promise, a lavish promise, that this other son, Ishmael, would also become a great nation, that God in his graciousness would also bless this child. The covenant, the promise God first made with Abram would remain with Isaac, that from him would come this nation that would bless the world. These would be a unique people whom God would uniquely work within and through. But the other boy would not be forgotten, that he also had a blessing for him. And so with this promise, I guess another opportunity for Abram to trust God, he obliges his wife, and the two are then sent off into the wilderness. And as the story then shifts to Hagar and the boy Ishmael, it seems to her that, these two are as good as dead. With their water skin empty under the hot sun, she leaves the boy under a bush and she sits down and she begins to sob. You can imagine it, right? But then in verse 17, this little phrase is repeated twice. God heard. You remember Ishmael's name? God hears. And then the promise made to Abram is confirmed for Hagar. The boy on the outside of God's covenant with Abram and Isaac is also blessed, and extravagantly so. And the story then ends up with him growing up to be an archer, married to an Egyptian woman living in the desert of Paran, an outsider to the covenant, but blessed by God, and the recipient of a merciful promise of God. Well, after chapter 21, Ishmael largely disappears from the narrative, but not entirely so. In chapter 25, Ishmael's genealogy is provided, and genealogies are always important. And we learn there that Ishmael, like Israel, also has 12 sons who become the leaders of 12 tribes. And these 12 tribes are called the Ishmaelites, and they live throughout northern Arabia. And the Ishmaelites are mentioned often throughout the Old Testament. And while there are, periodic hostilities between them and the tribes of Israel, they're actually never ever seen as Israel's arch enemy, such as Egypt or Babylon or the Philistines may have been. And in fact, most often, these two people are at peace with one another. These two nations, brothers from different mothers, are living side by side, and this relative harmony is what we also see the last time that we encounter and read about Ishmael himself. In Genesis chapter 25, Abraham dies, and the two boys are standing together at the edge of their father's tomb. And I want you to listen to how this scene is described there, beginning in verse 7. Abraham lived 175 years. And then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man full of years, and he was gathered to his people. Here it is. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zorah the Hittite, the field Abram had brought from the Hittites. Sorry, I missed up a couple of names there. But two brothers, right? Two nations united around their common grief, burying their common father, Abraham. Which leads us now then to think about this first lesson. It's taken a while to get here, but here we are. And it's about how we think about people groups in the world from God's perspective. You notice how I mentioned earlier that the Ishmaelites lived in northern Arabia? That's right. Jewish and Christian and Islamic traditions have long associated Ishmael's descendants with many of the Arab tribes of northern Arabia. That from Isaac came Israel, the bearers of God's covenant, but from Ishmael came the Arabians, the bearers of God's blessing. And the picture of these two people standing together, Isaac and Ishmael at their father's tomb, is not unusual. I think given our current world and context, we often conclude that these two great peoples, they've always been at war with each other, right? A never-ending story of hostility. But when you study the Old Testament and the history that has unfolded even since those days, since post-biblical days, you learn that that isn't actually the case. That these people who are now, yes, very much hostile toward each other, it hasn't always been this way. Now, some of you, you know the story in more detail, and maybe even at this point you're pushing back a little bit because you're thinking about something that we read in chapter 16, something that I actually skipped over earlier on. Let's go back to it. In that passage, Hagar is pregnant, and conflict arises between her and Sarai, and so Hagar goes on the run, but while there, it's there that the angel of the Lord meets with her, and he gives her this promise. But this is what he says there: "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility toward all of his brothers." Now, the thing about these verses is that they've led some recent students of the Bible to conclude that the Bible here is predicting then this perpetual hostility between Ishmael's descendants and Israel. And then we draw this into the current world events, and when we do that, it's concluded, well, this is why there are these wars today between Israel and between the Arab states. It's because of this prophecy. But there's pretty big problems with this. The first is that the Hebrew in these verses is very tricky, and the scholars are divided over their meaning and interpretation, truly. And the second, though, is that Genesis and then the rest of the scripture and the history itself presents a more nuanced picture in which Ishmael becomes a nation that's not always or even often at war with Israel, but in fact actually usually is at peace with Israel. And I guess here's the point that I'm trying to make in this. The picture that we have in Genesis is one of God's blessing to both Isaac and Ishmael, and of these two brothers standing together with their common father. And I have found that image so profoundly moving this week, especially in our world where these people are indeed currently not at peace with each other. And to take this a step further, in a world of polarization where we then are always urged to take sides in this dispute and others like it, it seems that one of the messages of our passage is that God doesn't share this sentiment. Ishmael, he blesses and he loves, just like he loves Isaac. And yes, one of these sons has the glorious privilege of carrying God's covenant promise, but both of these people are tended to and are blessed by God. It seems he loves them both, Isaac and Ishmael. But that's just the beginning of the story. Remember, we're only in Genesis. And when you scroll out and read through the rest of the biblical story, you discover, well, it's not actually just these two that he loves and blesses, but he loves and blesses all peoples and all tribes. And in the end, the picture we are given is one of all peoples standing united, now not around the tomb of Abram, but around the empty tomb of the Redeemer Jesus, who came to us as God's fulfillment of his promise to Isaac. All people gathered to him. And perhaps this image then of these two boys and the trajectory toward all people is going to maybe reorient some of your understanding, transform your affections, and enliven your prayers as you pray for our world, that God is this God of lavish, unmerited blessings to all people, and he invites us to live within this alignment, to join him in this posture of blessing, and to reject the pull toward prejudice and polarizations that cause us to reject one over the other. No, God invites us into his blessing of all people. Now, one other brief reflection. Throughout the scriptures, we are constantly confronted with this unrelenting picture of God's provision and love for the outsider. God is constantly seeing. And the seeing is this demonstrated as prophets of Israel railed against Israel for their consistent failure to see that God's blessing to them was to be a blessing for all nations, as the aliens and strangers are to be invited into their world. And then in Jesus, we watch as he sees the outsiders, those rejected by the leaders in the rule-bound religion of Israel. Jesus sees them. And in fact, one of the depictions or descriptions that's used most often for Jesus is that he sees the people and he has compassion on them. Okay, so to Hagar. In Genesis chapter 16, Hagar is in this dispute with Sarai and she runs away. But while on the run in the desert wild, God comes to her. And as we saw, it's there that he makes a promise to her that from her will come a great nation, also with descendants too numerous for her to even count. And hearing of this unmerited mercy, it's Hagar who gives God a name. It's the slave who names the divine. And what does she call him? She calls him El Roi, the God who sees. El Roi, the seeing God. Ishmael, he hears. He sees. He hears. Who does he see? Who does he hear? The slave girl and the boy outside of God's covenant, sobbing and wailing in the wilderness. And what does he do? He blesses lavishly, ridiculously. You too get to become a nation. God sees. God hears the outsider and you. And it would seem that we are most like him then when we become a people who do the same.